HBCU Research Leadership and Policy. I'm Dr. Melanie Carter, Director of the Center, and pleased to have you join us for another episode of Turning Pages, or author Talks. Today we have a very special guest and a very special book that we'll be discussing. We're joined by Dean Emerita and Professor here at Howard University, Dr. Leslie Fenwick, and we'll be discussing her book, Jim Crow's Pink Slip, The Untold Story of Black Principal and Teacher Leadership, that was published by Harvard Education Press in 2022. So we're really excited about Dr. Fenwick's appearance. She certainly is a well-known scholar in the field. The book has received numerous awards. Of course, we've seen it everywhere from NPR as the book of the day. It's continued to rise and make significant strides in all the outlets, including Amazon. It's won multiple awards, including the Gloria Ladson-Billings Award from AACTE, was extremely impressive. So Dean Fenwick, or Dean Emerita Fenwick, has certainly been on quite a tour for the last 3 years discussing her book with a range of audiences. So certainly we're proud of the work that she continues to do on behalf of the field of education. And I think this book is really an amazing contribution to the field. The other day, maybe the last week or so, I was reading something, and someone had posted somewhere a stack of books that they consider to be a part of the African American history canon around education. And that stack included James Anderson's book, which I think everybody should read weekly. Okay. The Education of Blacks in the South, 1860 to 1935, and just some other really, really amazing works. I believe Vanessa Walker's work, Their Highest Potential. There were others there that, again, I think should be regular reading on anyone who's concerned about higher teacher education or education generally, or Black history, period. And certainly Jim Crow's Pink Slip was actually in that pile, which didn't surprise me, but I took a little picture of it, and I thought, now this is really, really great, because again, it really demonstrates the significance of the work, and why it's so important, and why it really has provided fertile soil for future research. And not only future research, it's really changed the gaze in terms of how we think about teacher education, how we think about Black principals and their role and critical importance to education, K through 12 and beyond. And so again, Dr. Fenwick, certainly we want to thank you for joining us today. And we have a series of questions, certainly always, to ask you about your book, and ask some questions about what you've learned and what you think is so important to share with all of us. So I'll try to stick to my questions. As you know, we've been friends for many years. I have many others, some of which I won't be able to raise here, but certainly I look forward to the dialogue. So let me begin with just the first question, which is, what inspired you to write this book, and which key experiences or influences shaped its content?
Well, thank you, Dr. Carter, first of all, for the invitation to join this author's talk this afternoon. And before I get into kind of that response, you're really to be commended for founding the Center for HBCU Research Leadership and Policy, and continuing to expand the reach of research and policy advocacy, and just authentic knowledge about our institutions. You have moved our institutions, kind of our image beyond the band. The band is great, but we are more than that. We are scholars in our students, in our faculty, in our administration. So thank you for building this venue, and I wish it continued growth. So Jim Crow's Pink Slip grew out of at least two experiences. The first experience, growing up in a home with parents who attended segregated all-Black schools. So I'm not only my parents, but on both sides of my family, my grandparents and great-grandparents all attended segregated all-Black schools. Well, as a child, one of the things I observed, but I didn't know this seeped into me so much. Not only did my parents teach my brothers and I everything we knew about Black history, because at that time, I mean, we're similar in age. Doctor, I think I'm older than you, but I know I'm older
We
than
won't.
you.
Okay.
But uh, we didn't learn Black history or American. If you leave out Black history, you've left out some of American history, right? Because Black history is American history. So we didn't learn that in school.
Hmm.
So everything I knew about Black history, I learned from my parents at home.
Hmm.
And I was always struck. And I remember talking to my mom about why is this not what I'd say to her, what you and daddy are teaching us is not in school. And her response to that was, oh, girl, we know something other people don't know. So, what child doesn't like revel in the fact that they know something other adults don't know?
Hmm.
But I noticed this continued, not just elementary school and high school and college, and even in my PhD program, right? So, the first thing that made me write this book is a personal experience in the home of my parents, learning Black history. And then they had this kind of game they would play all the time. I mean, my dad's 93. Up until my mom left this earth, passed, they were still doing this game. And the game was a one-upsmanship about the schools, the teachers that they had in their schools. So
Hmm.
I've said this to you before. My mom would say, she attended the Great Sumner High School in Kansas City, Kansas. Um, my biology teacher graduated from Howard University and did his PhD in biology at the University of Chicago. My dad would counter, and this would go on and on and on. It's like a thing with them. Well, my French teacher finished Dunbar High School, which is the high school my father graduated from here in Washington, D.C., the famed Dunbar High School, and then attended Radcliffe, and in 1926 earned her master's degree in French at the Sorbonne. This little game, back and forth, was just part of the household conversation. It could break out at any time. Okay. And then when they had their friends over, I would hear them doing this with their friends. And their friends had not grown up in Washington, D.C. or Kansas City, Kansas. Many times they were from small cities in the deep South, Florida and Georgia. Uh, and those friends had experienced harsh segregation. Okay. Um, and they would do the same thing. They would name these people, and they were very specific about their academic credentials and their expression of their love and admiration for them. In fact, my mom showed me one of the student newspapers from her era. So this was slightly before she attended Sumner.
Hmm.
So this is maybe the late 1930s,
Hmm.
where the students had a section in that newspaper. I have this newspaper. And she said this was common, where they would list their faculty who had earned master's and doctoral degrees. They would have their name, the degree, the institution from which they earned their degree, and the title of their thesis or dissertation. This was in the student newspaper. What that told me, um, really coming from my mom's narrative and reading this for myself, was that students recognized this was important and they included it in their student newspaper. So that's kind of the first place. And I encourage my students and other authors that their positionality really matters. Those are not just sterile words, because I didn't learn this anywhere else. And when I went to the library, I wasn't seeking something I didn't know. I was seeking verification of what I knew. And what I knew was edifying and true
Hmm.
about the Black community and not being taught. So all of that's wrapped up in being a daughter of Dr. and Mrs. Joseph and Faye Fenwick.
Mhm.
Positionality. The second um, is uh, related to my doctoral program, which was an outstanding program. When I was a PhD student, I was really looking forward to a politics of education class because Brown was not part of my lived experience, right? We were younger than that. So I thought, Brown is the politics of education. I couldn't wait to take this particular class. And I remember being a bit more than a bit deflated when I got to the class and we were beginning the class with the Charlotte Mecklenburg decision. I remember as a doctoral student saying, what? This is all wrong. We're supposed to begin with Brown. Having said that, the professor then proceeded to put up a transparency, not a PowerPoint, which we
There you go.
used to. I'm sharing our age here.
There you go.
Um, and this transparency, and I didn't know where this came from. It was very jarring of all of these negative statistics about Black people. I, I really, even today, I'm perplexed by why the course began this way.
Mhm, mhm,
And I thought that others in the class would respond as I, like,
mhm,
why are we, what are
mhm,
all these statistics? And I said, so I raised my hand, and you don't want to be offensive or antagonistic. You're a new PhD student trying to get along, learn. You view your faculty as these repositories of knowledge and wisdom. At least that was my perspective.
mhm,
So I reluctantly raised my hand and asked the professor, do you think that by sharing these naked statistics out of any context, which I happen to believe, based on my experience, are actually inaccurate, that
mhm,
you're not reinforcing racist notions about the Black community, Black people at large? Well, there was kind of this stiff necked, utter silence in
mhm,
the class. I looked to my PhD buddies, everybody just straight ahead. And I'm trying to be as respectful, and appropriate to the faculty member. And he didn't have a response to that. He just kind of looked at me like, you're a new doctoral student. You'll get the deal. You'll understand later. And he proceeded to not unpack these statistics,
mhm,
not contextualize them,
mhm,
but he
mhm,
just proceeded to talk about them. So I
mhm,
left the class with an inner real anger
mhm,
because now I've experienced this from elementary school, this being either no presentation,
mhm,
curricular absence about Black people from elementary through high school through college. And now I'm in a PhD program. So I'm thinking, this just won't happen here. It's a
mhm,
PhD program. And it's happening again.
mhm,
So I marched from the building where we had our classes over to the education library, education psychology library. And I'm determined to bring back to this professor positive or accurate data about Black people before the next class. And this is at a time when you actually have to go to the library, go in the stacks. Now our students, scholars, we can sit at our computers and access so much, not everything, but so
mhm,
much. So I'm just in the stacks and I'm flipping through, I'm going, looking, trying to find books that will speak to this quest,
mhm,
right? And literally, and I've said this before, almost in like a Harry Potter kind of way, all these books, and there's this black binder, and it kind of falls out because I'm flipping past these titles. If the title doesn't indicate anything related to my quest, I'm trying to, do this pretty quickly. And this binder falls out, and in that binder are the transcripts from a series of US Senate hearings about the displacement of Black principals. Um, but the binder title is truncated. It says US Senate Black. And
mhm,
that's what drew my attention to this. And I've been carrying around those transcripts since that time, some copy of them. And as you know, the transcripts are the primary but not exclusive evidentiary base for my book. I was struck that this series of U.S. Senate hearings was occurring in 1971.
Mhm.
You know, Brown occurs in 54,
Mhm.
but the Senate hearings are in 1971. So those two experiences collide. And for years, Dr. Carter, I'm waiting for someone else to write this book. I said, oh,
Mhm.
this book is out there
Mhm.
because these Senate hearings have been cited hundreds of times. But as I waited or thought that someone else was going to do this, I didn't see the book. And here we are.
Here we are. So it was up to you to write it. That was your work to do. So, and it's really amazing. Again, the firsthand accounts that are included in those hearings, and that you really illuminate. This is about real people. Had impact on real school districts and communities in our nation. And so, again, the meticulous work around actually um, dissecting those transcripts and presenting it in a way that helps us to understand the personal nature of it and what it meant for our community and all the nation is really quite compelling, to say the least. And so I commend you on the work. And so, what were some of the what I would call central themes or findings, and how do you envision them contributing to the field of education broadly,
Yeah.
especially around teacher preparation and principal preparation?
Well, the first thing I would say is that one of the overarching pieces of this untold story
Mhm.
um, includes my belief that we have misdefined Brown. Okay. So as I'm unpacking the purge of 100,000
Mhm.
exceptionally credentialed Black principals and teachers,
Mhm.
I'm also reading litigation associated with those principals and teachers seeking reinstatement
Mhm.
or seeking, redress after having been fired, dismissed, and demoted. And I read several times, I mean, more than several times, a series of cases that say that the way we will know, we being the nation, that we have achieved integration is by the integration of school personnel. Okay. Not students.
Mhm.
Singleton, Bradley, Green, Lee. There are a series of other decisions that are unequivocal about this.
Mhm. Mhm.
The single criterion by which we will know that we have achieved integration is integration of school personnel. And yet, what happens is the opposite of that.
Mhm.
Massive resistance, white massive resistance to the decision. And this is a point that really irritates me sometimes when I speak about this and that, or someone writes, a journalist or someone, they'll say Brown resulted in
Mhm.
the firing, Fenwick says Brown resulted in the firing, dismissal, and demotion of 100,000 Black principals and teachers. I never say that.
Mhm.
Brown was a moral feat for this country.
Mhm.
It was an intellectual feat for the attorneys, the NAACP attorneys who crafted that decision.
Mhm.
They used new jurisprudential theory to craft that decision and other decisions which were part of it, that were prior to it. Um, Massive white resistance to the decision in the 17 dual system states, from Delaware down to Florida, over to Texas, Arkansas, et cetera, perverted the decision and um, also resulted in the closure of segregated all Black schools, the firing, dismissal, and demotion of 100,000 exceptionally credentialed Black principals and teachers, and the shuffling of Black students into previously segregated all white schools. Okay. So um, this issue around massive resistance to the decision led to all of these deleterious outcomes. So the first thing is that we have misdefined Brown. And in my book, in Jim Crow's Pink Slip, I traced the day that we shifted our attention,
Mhm.
and that day being June 15th, 1971. The series of Senate hearings were looking at this displacement, and those hearings kind of began on June 14th. And the next day, we just drop that and begin to define segregation, desegregation, integration as racial ratios of Black and white students one to the other. So we miss, and we are still missing,
Yes,
because
yes.
even the contemporary research, which points to the resegregation of public K-12 schools, is missing the larger point,
Mhm.
which is we were to have begun with the adults,
Mhm.
integrate the superintendency, the principalship, the teaching force. The second piece um, of the story is about these 100,000. Who were these
Mhm.
individuals who were purged? The largest purge in the history of US public education. Um, these educators, uh, principals and teachers in segregated all Black schools, were more credentialed than their peers in segregated all white schools.
Mhm.
This is not a narrative that has been shared in the research literature or commentary about integration and desegregation or segregated schools. It's almost as if the segregationist lie about inferiority made its way into the research literature and has been perpetuated. Um, the US Senate hearings and other documents highlight this fact. It is the overarching narrative.
Mhm.
It's not a
Mhm.
sub narrative, it's not subterranean, it is the narrative.
Mhm. Mhm.
And in fact, the Senate hearings open with Senator Mondale, who was subbing for Senator Edward Brooke, the African American senator from New York, um, asking a Dr. Betty Smith about her experiences. And she talks about in the state of Georgia being one of two
Mhm.
educators who hold an earned doctorate,
Mhm.
and seeing the membership of her professional organization, meaning the ranks of principals, Black principals,
Mhm.
decline from something like 169 to 7 as
Mhm.
a result of white resistance to the Brown decision.
Mhm.
Um, I'll pause there because I don't know if I fully answered your question or if there was another.
No, I think you answered it. And I think, I mean, there's so much there, Dr. Fenwick, in terms of thinking about that. But a couple of things I want to mention. One is, as you're saying, which is really, as you know, as you point out, extremely important to think about in terms of the intent was to deal with the adults. And by not doing that, what that meant is that the lives of these children and other children were left in hands unfamiliar and perhaps not as invested in the thriving of those children. So even in your book, you even talk about that in terms of what that meant for how children are were punished or reprimanded. I mean, all these kinds of things we see flow from that because certainly um, you and I both know that during segregation, these dual systems of segregation were actually very elaborate. I mean, there was a whole, in many districts, there were two complete systems. That one that certainly white control, and then the other that had Black leadership, Black thinking, Black people in decision making authority in some regard that helped to ensure that these places were supportive to children the best they could, given the circumstance. Because there's always some other um, state
Mhm.
superintendent. John Henry Clark has a wonderful short story entitled "The Boy Who Painted Christ Black," and there's a short videotape that I show in my history of education courses when I taught K through 12 history, and it has the sort of exchange or the relationship, highlights the relationship between the uh, between a black principal played by Wesley Snipes, no less, and the white superintendent of schools, and how that push and pull, but you see a sense of responsibility to protect those children, and I think that sort of brain drain, or that drain of folks who were certainly connected and committed to the community, has an impact even today, which I think your book and what you just said so aptly describes. So again, very powerful.
Yeah, that is so it. So
Hmm.
I
Hmm.
want your listening audience to think about this. We think about Brown and we kind of
Hmm.
our gaze is K-12, but remember in the 17 dual system states, the racial segregation was all the way through. It was K-12, college, and graduate and professional schools. So
Right.
dental school, PhD programs, law, med, you name the school,
Hmm.
it was racially segregated and white reserved. So all Black people, all white people, all every other kind of people are paying tax dollars. And in this case, in the 17 dual system states, Black citizens are denied their 14th Amendment rights. They are denied their full citizenship and can't attend institutions that they're paying to support or that they have a right to attend as an American citizen.
Hmm.
So, and we think of the I think the segregation, desegregation um, conversation, dialogue as an affliction of the Deep South. When in
Hmm.
fact, we're talking about states as far north as Delaware, and
Right.
also at certain points in history, uh, we've had as many as 33 of our 50 states that were operating racially exclusive public facilities, either by state law or by racialized local customs.
Absolutely.
So here we have this story, this untold story is an unpacking of a narrative that has not been told, right?
Hmm.
It's an untold story. It's not a counter narrative, it's the truth.
There you go.
Because
It's not
what
a
has
counter
been
narrative.
shared is the counter narrative.
There you are. That's right. Well, that's a
One
lie. I don't know.
lies, what? And so
Yeah,
one of the
okay.
things, I've said this, I would hear, and this is in the literature, over and over and over again. Um, and I love poetry, but I
Hmm.
use my poetry voice to make fun of what's in the literature.
Okay.
Okay. So after Brown, Blacks left the education professions to pursue careers previously unopened to them. This has been the perpetrator's
Hmm. Hmm.
over and over.
Hmm.
But I had this thing that was instilled from the household that I grew up in, the home I grew up in, that when you say Black, you're talking about me.
There
So
you go.
immediately when I read Black teachers and read this, like, this isn't, I don't believe this is factual. One
Hmm.
of the things that you and I teach our doctoral students, what differentiates you from Archie Bunker, if they remember Archie Bunker, is you are to have data
There
and
you go.
information to
That's right.
inform your claims. You don't just make claims.
There you go.
A
Exactly.
lot of the segregationists lie about Black education, Black principals, Black teachers, the state of segregated all Black schools made its way into the literature and has been perpetrated up right now until 2025. So
Hmm.
when we walk around saying, believing, writing, speaking that that was the history,
Hmm.
then the burden of that history is on Black educators. You left the profession.
There you go.
You abandoned the profession. Well, the historical record shows the profession was taken from
Absolutely.
Black educators, an
Hmm.
exceptionally credentialed group of Black educators.
Hmm.
So, so that's the first correction, because if we think that research informs policy and funding,
Mm-hmm.
and our research is off North Point, our compass is off North Point, then
Mm-hmm.
everything that follows is likely off North Point
There
too.
you go.
So the first goal of the book was to shatter the myth and the
There
lie.
you go.
The
That's right.
second was to tell the story of these principals and teachers, as you mentioned, to personalize their story, to recognize their story and their journey, and to try to tell their story as they would tell it,
Perfect.
as they would tell it. So we have these individuals are existing in a system where wherever they want to go to, if they want to be educated in their home state and they're an African American citizen, a Black citizen, almost their exclusive option is HBCUs, historically
Mm-hmm.
Black colleges and universities, as we know. And they build these institutions for that purpose. And then if they want to go to graduate or professional school, master's, PhD, DDS, MD, JD, this is not just unique, obviously, to educators. If the HBCU in their state does not offer the academic program that they're pursuing, they must leave the state to earn
Mm-hmm.
their graduate degree.
That's right.
And the state, my favorite chapter in my book is chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Uh,
and I talk about
the myth
uh,
of Black professional inferiority.
the myth of Black professional inferiority. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
These Jim Crow laws that were insulting and convoluted, um, what that meant for the daily life of a Black citizen who wanted to earn a graduate degree that may not have been offered, that was not offered at his or her HBCU. Because remember, at the time, it's only Howard University, Atlanta University, Meharry Medical College. There are few HBCUs offering graduate and professional degree
Mm-hmm.
programs. So the states invent something called, in an effort to continue to skirt the 14th Amendment rights of Black citizens, they invent Negro tuition scholarships. And I talk about this in chapter 2.
Mm-hmm.
Those scholarships are not the kind of scholarship that we think of in contemporary terms. They were a segregationist tool and essentially told the Black citizen, you can get an education, a graduate education. You won't get it here. They're used to boot the citizen out of the state so that he or she will pursue their graduate education elsewhere. And I track in the book the amount of money that's designated for these Negro tuition scholarships.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so the Negro tuition scholarships are used by Black citizens seeking graduate and professional education.
Mm-hmm.
And they help support, the funds help support their seeking graduate education elsewhere.
Okay.
So where do these Black principals and teachers go?
Mm-hmm.
And this is the story, the opposite of exceptionalism.
Mm-hmm.
It is not about Black exceptionalism. One Black person goes here, this
Mm-hmm.
is about several generations of Blacks
Absolutely.
playing by the rules, convoluted and insulting as they are,
Mm-hmm.
and being determined to earn their own educational credentials and remain of service to their community. So I trace where they go in this order of frequency. So at least 2 generations of Black educators, principals, and teachers earn their master's and doctoral degrees in this order of frequency: New York University,
Mm-hmm.
Columbia University, University of Chicago,
Mm-hmm.
University of Pennsylvania,
Mm-hmm.
Harvard University, University of Michigan, The Ohio State, Iowa State University. I always get Iowa State and University of Iowa confused, but this is where 2 generations. So at this time, we're talking about the late 1800s, the
Mm-hmm.
early 1900s. And as evidence or one piece of evidence, between 1930 and 1960, Columbia University alone awards 144 doctorates to HBCU
Mm-hmm.
graduates. But that's 1930. This was happening well
Sure.
prior to 1930. And I talk about this in the book. In the book, I label what the educators do, the principals and teachers, an academic migration.
Mm-hmm.
They leave, one of those dual system states, go to these Northeastern and Midwestern universities. These are institutions that were nationally prominent at the time and remain nationally prominent today.
Mm-hmm.
And then they return to the South to teach in segregated all Black schools. So truly, the jewel in the school um, is the jewels in the schools are these individuals, these principals and teachers who leave their HBCU with that unique intellectual perspective stamped on their mind and integrated into that unique, I think, intellectual perspective that they were taught at HBCUs. On top of that, or intermingled with that, is the preparation that they receive at nationally prominent universities. And they bring all of that into their schools, along with their own experience of having attended segregated all Black schools. So they come back with at least two characteristics. One, having experienced nationally prominent universities, and two, having experienced integrated education. Now, the experiences at these prominent institutions was not perfect. I don't
Mm-hmm.
want to communicate that. Having said that, they were in settings that where they could learn, where they had some loosening some
Mm-hmm.
of the racist or social strictures of the southern states. They come back. Their white peers have had the benefit of being able to go to their state institution. And so most of their white peers have remained local,
Mm-hmm.
graduates of normal schools. Maybe they have a certificate.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they've gone to the state institution, large or small, in that locale. So they've not moved physically out of or intellectually out of the strictures, the legal strictures, and the localized customs of racism and segregation. Um, and so we
And that's
have,
important that's important. That's a very important point because they're
so
working with people who have no, who don't have the exposure they have.
no, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a whole line of thinking. I won't go into this direction right now, but why didn't they do an exodus? I examine that as I write the book, but I don't talk about that in the book about why these educators returned to the South. It was a migration. They went there and they
Sure.
came back.
That's
It
right. That's right.
wasn't it wasn't an exodus. So here they are. Thurgood Marshall cites the case of a man in southern Georgia
Mm-hmm.
who had an undergraduate degree from Fort Valley State College and University, as it's known now, and an undergraduate degree and a master's degree, I think, from Columbia. He was in a small school,
Mm-hmm.
and his school's being desegregated. And in this particular district or locale, it was his school wasn't summarily closed. He was just fired, and a white principal was brought in for this small school during the transition to desegregation. Okay. And that man was replaced by a milkman. This is Thurgood Marshall's most, what he calls the most
Mm-hmm.
egregious case.
Yes.
I have to pause here for a second to say there were a number of magical moments writing this book, a number of
Mm-hmm.
frustrating moments where I had to step away, but a number of magical moments. So as I'm reading, um, all of these documents, it occurs to me
Mm-hmm.
that the NAACP attorneys, Thurgood Marshall and many others, they had to know that Black principals and teachers would be fired if they were successful because these attorneys, these NAACP attorneys, were Black too. Not
Mm-hmm.
the
Mm-hmm. Most of
majority
them.
of them.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
And they knew not as an academic matter, but because they too had experienced segregation, limited opportunities in terms of where they could attend school. Their 14th Amendment rights had been violated too.
Absolutely.
So they knew the deep tissue culture of
That's right.
racism in these states. And this was really bothering me. I'm like, they had to know. So I call Joellen Bashir, who at the time was one of the archivists at Moreland Spingarn at
Okay.
Howard University.
Uh-huh.
And I'm dean at this time. And I say to her that I believe there's evidence that Marshall and others knew that Black principals and teachers would be fired, dismissed, and demoted. I'm telling her about my book.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And I'm sure that evidence is in Moreland Spingarn. But as a dean, I don't know if I have time to come over and sit in Moreland Spingarn and find this.
Find it.
And I'm treading lightly here because the last thing a librarian, archivist, and uh, certainly at Moreland Spingarn or anywhere else wants to hear is you don't have time. So I don't
Sure.
quite say that.
Mm-hmm.
And she was very generous to me.
Mm-hmm.
And but I bounce around saying that, and she hears what I'm not saying, and she says, "Let me see what I can do." This was
Mm-hmm.
a magical moment, like, and
Mm-hmm.
so some weeks she says, "Let me see what I can do, Dean Fenwick." And some weeks pass, maybe like 3 weeks, and I come home and I have a brown envelope. It's not marked in any other way other than it says Dean Leslie Fenwick handwritten on it. And I open this brown envelope. I still have this brown envelope. And she has sent me copies of letters uh, and other documents that were written by, drafted by Thurgood Marshall. He has come up with the idea of the NAACP's Department for Teacher Information and Security, a
Mm-hmm.
fund that will hold money to defend Black principals and teachers whom he and the NAACP will believe will lose their jobs. And the first memo, so she answered this, Joellen
Wow.
Bashir answered this question for me. 1952, I have the memo where Marshall is writing
Mm-hmm.
to some Northern philanthropists seeking money,
Mm-hmm.
1952, to establish the Teacher Information and Security Department. And he's laying out what this will be. And then it's typed up, but he has all this handwriting on the side. And it answered the question. Yeah, they knew. They knew
Exactly.
because they knew racism. They knew because of their own experience. They
Mm-hmm.
knew because of their positionality.
Mm-hmm.
So had you sent a lawyer down from New York, just any random person from
Mm-hmm.
New York, to look at the circumstance and examine the circumstance, they wouldn't have had the positionality that Marshall and others had relative to racism and segregation and abridged citizenship. Um, and that was a magical moment to receive those materials and to have an archivist assist me with that. So we have these people.
Mm-hmm.
And Marshall put the number, this is never cited. I've not seen it cited anywhere. He
Mm-hmm.
put the number at 75,000. But depending on how you open or close the aperture in terms of time from
Mm-hmm.
52, because remember, Black principals and teachers were being fired prior to Brown. They got letters saying, hey, if this thing is successful from the superintendents,
Mm-hmm.
then we won't need you. And some just a priori fired the Black teachers. So I'm mainly looking at from about 1952 to the late 1970s, right? Even though Brown occurs in 54. So here we have 100,000 exceptionally credentialed,
Mm-hmm.
academically credentialed Black teachers and principals. Um, the Senate hearings also have state by state reports from those 17 dual system states asking those reporters, those state department
Mhm.
officials to report on this matter in their
Mhm.
states. And they do report, and I share this in the book,
Mhm.
that Black principals and teachers also had higher levels of professional licensure because at that time, most states had levels of professional licensure,
Mhm.
and they had larger percentages of Black principals and teachers held professional licensure.
Mhm.
So, more likely to have a master's and doctoral degree from a nationally
Mhm.
distinguished university, higher levels of professional licensure, and a higher concentration of licensed teachers and principals.
Mhm.
None of this in the literature. And we still are reciting, I think uh, Fultz gets credit for at least tracing it to 38,000.
Mhm.
But Thurgood Marshall himself said it was at least 75,000. Okay. And my aperture says it was 100,000. And so, you know, we both went to the Ohio State University.
We did.
I grew up on University of Michigan football.
Mhm.
I was in Northern
Shame on
Ohio.
you.
Shame on me, right?
Okay, exactly.
But I want us to think about uh, the University of Michigan's football stadium, which holds
Mhm.
like 108,
Mhm.
117,000 people, and put 100,000 Black principals and teachers in that stadium,
Mhm.
and they're
Mhm.
gone like that.
Okay, that's right.
And when I say they're gone like that, over a period of time,
Mhm. Mhm.
their expertise,
Exactly.
their dot. So this also is not just the story of representation, a Black or brown face in front of Black or brown children. There is
Mhm.
power there. There is extreme power in representation.
Right, exactly.
This is also the story of expertise. It's
Mhm.
also the story of commitment to democratic ideals,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
One of the things in the contemporary literature that absolutely drives me crazy is when Black principals and teachers of this era are discussed. You talk about their role as community leaders, but it's not strong enough. It
Mhm.
goes back to poetry voice. These Black educators were community leaders. Okay, what? Let's really unpack that.
Mhm.
What were they doing that made them community leaders? They weren't just representational. No,
Mhm.
Black and James D. Anderson does a wonderful job of laying this out in his
Yes.
book, The Education of Blacks in the South, as you mentioned earlier.
Mhm.
And I talk about this in my book. These Black principals and teachers were establishing NAACP chapters because they
Mhm.
were fighting against, uh, not being able to vote because of
That's right.
state law, the
Mhm.
violence that was associated with
Mhm.
voting rights.
Mhm.
And so they were leading voting rights campaigns and establishing NAACP chapters.
Mhm.
These things were being done at physical,
Oh
risk
yes.
to their physical safety. They could be
Mhm.
lynched, they could be killed,
Mhm.
um, they could lose their job, and yet
Absolutely.
they
Mhm.
knew that voting rights and NAACP chapters were critical to the advancement
Mhm.
of the community. So they were not just community leaders.
Mhm.
These people were warriors. And this ethic around their warriorship had been inculcated, I believe, as part of their HBCU education. It had to be.
Mhm.
Um, um, it just had to be. That was part of
Mhm.
the DNA of their academic preparation at HBCUs.
Mhm.
So these individuals are purged from the public school systems across these 17 dual system states right at a time when our nation needs them, needs their
Mhm.
intellect, needs their experiences, needs their expertise to
Mhm.
define Brown, how it would be implemented, and how the nation's schools would look
That's right.
with their firing, dismissal, and demotion.
Mhm.
The segregationist hold maintains on how we define public education space. And we feel and see that even now in
Mhm.
2025.
Mhm.
Um, the curricular materials that students experience in K-12 schools in the United States are almost exclusively white in authorship, content, and imagery in 2025.
Mhm.
Um, Students in segregated all Black schools were exposed to Black history and culture through their teachers, even if that Black history and culture was a localized Black history, meaning the naming of their schools
Mhm. Mhm.
after important local figures or more prominent figures like Lawrence Dunbar,
Mhm.
um, others. We, this is a story of exceptional generations who maneuvered a system antagonistic to them
Mhm.
and were successful in that maneuver, but at the end of the day were captured by the arc of rabid racism.
Mhm.
And so it is a story of loss, but prior to the loss is a story of excellence and intellectual and political strategy. And I think that intellectual and political strategy can even be of assistance to us today. So, this is the largest purge of educator talent that we've ever experienced in American public schools. Um, we're living with the fallout of this today. So, that common phrase that historians say, history is not dead.
Mhm.
I say we're living with histories we don't know, and they're like ghosts, knocking things over, and we don't know what to attribute it to. So prior to massive resistance to the Brown decision
Mhm.
in the 17 dual system states, 35 to 50% of educators in those states were Black. We have no state that approaches those percentages today. We know that only 7% of the nation's teachers are Black, about 11% of the nation's 90,000 principals are Black, and less than 3% of the nation's nearly 14,000 superintendents are Black. Now, there's something
Well,
that
I'm gonna have to have you pause right there because I think we need to put some, we need to accentuate those points. So let me make sure I got those right. You said prior to this time, 35 to 50% of the educators in the South were Black. Is that what
in
you're saying?
this in
In
this
those
in
seven,
each state, and
in each
when I
state.
in each state,
And you're saying now only 7% of teachers are Black, 11% of principals, and 3% of superintendents.
yes. So we have 3.2 million teachers,
Mhm.
7% are Black.
I got you.
We have 90 to 93,000, about 90,000 principals, 11% are Black. We have 13,800 superintendents, less than 3% are Black. Now, here's the kicker. Black educators today are the nation's most academically credentialed educators the nation has. This was also true prior to
Mhm.
Brown. When we compare
Mhm.
Black educators' academic preparation, professional licensure in segregated all Black schools um, to white educators in segregated all white schools. So then and now, Black educators are the nation's most academically credentialed educator. What do I mean by that specifically? Black men and women who are teachers are more likely than their white peer who is a teacher to have a master's degree and a doctorate or a doctorate. The same is true for principals and superintendents. And those aren't what I would call Fenwick data. Those are IES data. They're not reported in the
Mhm,
National
mhm,
Center for Ed
mhm,
Statistics, but when I
mhm,
contacted IES about the
mhm,
data, I sent them my chart and I said, will
mhm,
you fill this? They sent me a chart. I said, that's not what I asked for.
mhm,
I sent them my chart and they
mhm,
filled it in. And that, um, I acknowledge those researchers who helped me with this. So the tragedy of this, the fallout,
mhm,
there is a through line in history between the history of the decimation, the firings, demotions, and dismissals of Black principals and teachers, and why we have these statistics now.
mhm, mhm,
It is
absolutely.
not the narrative that we left the profession, that
There you
Blacks
go.
left the profession.
Mhm,
The other piece of the through line is that Black educators segregated all Black schools as a group were more academically and professionally credentialed than their white peers. That's true today, too.
mhm,
So then the question becomes, with these academic credentials and professional experiences, why aren't Blacks better represented in the nation's educator workforce as teachers and principals and superintendents? And which group, if we want to go there, and I do talk about this in my book, which group is the least credentialed educator the nation has? White males. And yet they are underrepresented in the teaching force from which we typically get principals and superintendents and overrepresented in the superintendency. So
mhm.
when we say the public education system is faltering, one of the reasons I believe that it's faltering because of the is because of this history.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, you've made the case. It's more than you believe. You've made the case with empirical data that supports everything you're saying. So before I was like, well, is that Fenwick data? Was that okay? No, it's not. I mean, clearly, I mean, you've, you have actually provided us with evidence that actually documents this through line. So yeah, it's
and you know
absolutely
what I
true.
think about Dr. Carter? And again, I say this to young scholars, newly minted doctoral recipients. I say this to my doctoral students as well. Um, Early in my career, when I was an assistant professor at Clark Atlanta University, I was asked to be kind of randomly on a program about what was named then, this is the early 90s, the minority teacher pipeline. I still today don't know how I ended up being on this panel. I really don't. Because I was, I started this book out, it's to be a policy book.
Mhm,
I'm not a historian. But I kept being pulled into the stream of history. Then I got nervous and
mhm,
talked to my historian friends. Am I doing history right?
mhm,
And I have three friends who were very gracious with their time, noted historians um, who read portions of the book and gave me feedback. Anyway, so I'm on this panel. I'm a Clark Atlanta University assistant professor. The organization was meeting in Atlanta,
mhm,
and it's all senior people and me
mhm,
who are experts on the minority teacher pipeline. One reason I think I may have been pulled was as a person of color, as a Black
mhm,
faculty member, because there was no other Black person on this panel about the minority teacher pipeline. I think somebody said, well, wait a minute, who can we get? We're here in
mhm,
Atlanta. And I still don't know how my name came up, but it did. So after the panel, I asked someone whose name was prominent on this topic, who's still at one of the Ivy institutions, a white male scholar. I tell him, I have this idea, I'm looking at this history, and I share with him the premise of what I'm thinking about and wanting to write about. And he was kind, but he said, oh, Fenwick, that's just like anecdotal. That Don't worry about that. Now, this is what I think about. I don't think he was trying to be dismissive. He certainly didn't say it in an angry, mean tone. You don't have to say something in an angry, mean tone to be dismissive. Had I been an assistant professor at that Ivy institution, hearing this from a senior faculty member, I would have been tempted to turn my attention away from this scholarship.
mhm.
There was nothing in my home environment of Clark Atlanta University that deflated my scholarly interest,
Hmm.
that deflated what I knew to be true
Hmm.
and edifying. And I think about uh, young faculty who are in environments where people do not know this history, where it's
Hmm.
irrelevant to them, or
Hmm.
where they believe it's anecdotal, which is a stab in the eye to any scholar, right?
Absolutely.
What would have happened? And I wonder about the other stories that may not be the other stories and research, stories not being told,
Hmm.
research not being conducted,
Hmm.
that is vital to our understanding. Jim Crow's Pink Slip was intended to say, hey, readers, hey, America, look at Brown differently. It
Hmm.
wasn't just about race matching students in a classroom.
Hmm.
It was about starting with the adults and integrating school personnel. That was the criterion, according to Singleton, Bradley, Green, Lee, and numerous other decisions. And we
Right.
have wiped that from our mind.
Sure
And we
have.
still, right now, if you talk to a journalist or another scholar and you say the word desegregation, integration, immediately they're going to say, oh, well, you know, American schools have resegregated.
Hmm.
They're focused on the students. I'm not saying that's not a problem, but I'm saying we won't get to where we need to go until we really unpack this framework that is continuing to allow exceptionally credentialed Black educators not to be represented in the superintendency, central office directorships, um, principalships, and teaching forces. All those leadership areas that determine fiscal policy and
That's right.
implement fiscal policy, that determine and implement
Hmm.
education policy and instructional policy.
Absolutely. There's a quote from Jim Crow's Pink Slip that I think captures what you just said. And you say that um, because of this um, displacement of teachers, Black teachers and principals, that resulted in the near total disintegration of Black authority in every area of public education. So, I mean, again, that's simply profound. Well, you said so much, Dr. Fenwick. I was taking notes. If you didn't notice, okay, okay, because I'm like, you know what? I'm going to say some things about this because again, it's amazing. The work is amazing. Certainly, Crystal Sanders. We interviewed her actually for our last episode, and she's done a book recently, as you know, on the segregated scholarships. Forgotten Migration is the title of her book. And as I said to you, your chapter two, in terms of how you actually provide charts and tables indicating the allocation of those the money allocated to those scholarships is simply amazing. And certainly, I know several people and interviewed several people who were recipients of those scholarships.
Mhm.
Um, and again, just really thinking about that, and also knowing what that really meant in terms of their, as you said, credential. I mean, some of those statements you're making today, even though the book certainly provides evidence and it is not at all. It's very much in keeping with what you found. Those statements are to dominant sort of thinking around education, really, really um, uh, challenges the narrative. I mean, by saying that they were more credentialed now then and now, that's powerful in many ways, and so important to remember. So I want to just again, I can't say that enough how important that is. The other thing, there's several things, some of which I won't be able to say because I want to have you have a closing word, which on Jim Crow's Pink Slip, is that I wonder, when I look at the title, the subtitle, An Untold Story, is it really untold? I mean, the untold seems to be a bit benign, okay? And it really is malignant. I wonder if it's suppressed. I mean, because often it's not as if these people were quiet about losing their jobs or being fired or given these pseudo promotions, as you say. So this was not something that was done in some backroom alley, and these people did not accept these demotions or these push out lockouts firing. But now it's as if oh, we didn't know. Oh, this you knew the story. You actually created the story, enforced the story,
Mm.
strategized around the story. So I'm wondering what you think about that in terms of being untold. As you said, these even the hearings have been cited, right? So
Yeah.
people knew this happened. People lived this on, whether black, white, or whatever, but they decided over time not to tell it. And other stories they've decided not to tell. So I'm wondering what you think about that.
This is why I like talking to you, Dr. Carter, as a historian, ed historian, because your questions and statements, they're always starting something. And this is a starting something question. So I struggled with the title,
Okay,
right? For
okay.
the exact reasons that you said. And in fact, I'm going to come back to your untold part, but I
Okay.
almost titled the book Otherwise Qualified
Uh-oh.
because the state statutes, and I list the state, I show the state statutes
Mhm.
in the book, the state statutes that supported the Negro tuition scholarships. And many of those had a small n, by the way, so triply insulting, but
Sure.
they also they use the same language. The Negro tuition scholarship
Mhm.
provides funding for Negroes otherwise qualified.
Otherwise qualified.
That's what the state statutes say. Maryland, I cite Maryland in there, but Texas used the same language. They all borrowed the same language. And as early as 1938, 39, the Texas legislature allocated $25,000 for Negro tuition scholarships. Now, to put this in perspective, for the University of Texas that same year, they allocated about $116,000 for maintenance.
Mm-mm.
Okay? So don't talk to me about the affirmative action decision, right?
No, that's right.
Okay. So uh, Negroes otherwise qualified.
Mhm.
That's what this is the great finding of chapter 2,
Is there?
which
Mhm.
is not anecdotal. It took a
Not-
long time
mhm.
to do two things. One, find the language of the statutes, to find the statutes. And the Maryland state archivists were exceptionally helpful there. And Maryland has some of the best digitized resources. Um, and then if something is listed in a statute, then it's going to be listed in the state budget if there's a
Mhm.
budget implication.
Right.
So then matching, going state by state to find the statute language and see if that's matched with
Mhm.
budgets. Um, so the book was almost titled Otherwise Qualified, to pull this language out and to say, see, the state had culpability here.
Mhm. Mhm.
There was an infrastructure beyond a state law, just a broad state law,
Mhm.
that reinforced an apartheid education system
Mhm.
in the great United States of America, in our democracy. The untold piece, it's interesting that you would say this because this has been my experience, literally going from coast to coast talking about the book.
Mhm.
When there have been at least two responses to the book. When I'm talking to majority white audiences, the response is, oh my goodness. And many of those audiences are educators, some audiences are historians, civil rights activists, but I'm talking about predominantly white audiences that are one of those: educators, historians, civil and human rights activists. Um, how do we not know this? How do I not know this? This is unacceptable that I do not know this. There's not a resistance to knowing. There's a
Mhm.
like, oh, I can't believe I don't know. If I'm talking to majority Black audiences, two responses. Two, one, oh my goodness, how do I not know this? And how do I
Mhm.
not know this as a Black person?
Mhm.
Or two, and this is another magical moment related to the
Mhm.
book. I've gotten emails, or when individuals come up after a lecture, they said, you know what? I was 5. These are individuals who are above 50.
Mhm. Mhm.
I was 5 when I grew up in Louisiana. I grew up in
Mhm.
Florida. And I was 5 years old when my grandfather was fired as a principal, and I knew that something was wrong. Like I
Mm-hmm.
knew the family was upset,
Mm-hmm.
but I didn't know
You go.
what it meant.
Mm-hmm.
And these are people typically who haven't read the book. Maybe they're
Sure.
coming to a lecture. And then they read the book and then they also email me. But they come
Mm-hmm.
up afterwards and they say, I believe this history is tied to my family
There you
histories.
go.
And they buy books, they read the book, then they email me. And I have these beautiful testimonies
Mm-hmm.
about my grandfather's not living or my
Mm-hmm.
grandmother's not living.
Mm-hmm.
But I shared this with my mom. And
Mm-hmm.
she said, this is what happened in our family.
There you go.
And now readers email me saying, did you find this name?
There you go.
And that's always a moment that almost makes me want to cry. In the book,
Mm-hmm.
I had designated 4 pages just to list the names.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Melanie Carter, Springfield, Ohio,
Mm-hmm.
Leslie Fenwick, Toledo, what the names and where they were from. 4 pages. I wanted the reader to be reading, 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 and then stop and see these names. Well, my wonderful editor, profoundly grateful to her, editor in chief at Harvard Education Press, Jane Fargnoli. She said, Leslie, I don't think we can use 4 pages. I'm getting feedback from the formatters, like, I don't, we can't, but there's a page and a half or 2 pages.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted readers to have this experience like individuals have at the Vietnam
That's right. Absolutely.
Memorial, where you go up to that wall
Mm-hmm.
and you see usually men with tears in their eyes and they're touching these names of fellow soldiers or uncle or cousin or brother who fought in that war. And it's a remembrance. One of the lies that was perpetuated was this was anecdotal. This
Mm-hmm.
didn't happen. I cite a Georgia state superintendent saying, they're saying this, but you can't find the bodies.
Mm-hmm.
Well, here they are.
There
They
you go.
have a name and they have a story. There
Mm-hmm.
were real people and they're not far removed from us.
Not at all.
Many of
We
them,
know. We know. We know.
we know these people.
Absolutely.
Some, they're still living.
Absolutely.
The the other magical moment associated with this book is in May of this year, in May of last year, um, the Smithsonian National Museum
Mm-hmm.
of African American History and Culture had a 70th anniversary um, commemorative program about the Brown decision.
Mm-hmm.
And I had the occasion as a keynoter on that program to meet 4 of the living Little Rock Nine,
Mm-hmm.
these incredible icons,
Sure.
still strong and clear.
Mm-hmm.
And they thanked me for writing this book. And they
Mm-hmm.
said, this story about our experience
Mm-hmm.
is not told. Um, one of the gentlemen said, the reason when we were integrated into the public schools, one of the reasons nobody ever complained about academic performance, and I had not thought about this, is because we were superior, we were prepared in a superior manner from the school, in the school from which we were coming when we were
Absolutely.
integrated into the previously segregated all-white school.
Mm-hmm.
And they all said that in most cases, they were about a year ahead of their white peers.
Mm-hmm. The students when they integrated, right? Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
So the last thing I would say on this topic, because I've been asked about this book is not an underhanded or a sleight of the hand endorsement of segregation. It is a story about Black educational excellence. It is a story about intellectual and political strategizing.
Mm-hmm.
We don't agree with segregation as a policy because it abridges the experience of freedom, American freedom, and it's anti-democratic.
That's right.
Having said that, despite the racial strictures, John Hope Franklin talks about this, there were hundreds of thousands of Black people in every facet and walk of life who maneuvered this constrictive, demeaning, degrading system to assert their humanity,
Yeah.
to assert their intellectual ability, and in some cases, superiority, and to maintain strong American cultural values. It's that story. The shame
Yes.
of it is that it hasn't been told over and over and over again because these transcripts have been cited hundreds of times. And this is the story of the
Mm-hmm.
transcripts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's the story of the transfers. Although others have um, uh, told a different story, or a story that has not fully captured um, this really critical or core aspect of it, the way that Jim Crow's Pink Slip has. So again, congratulations on a wonderful contribution to the field and the work that really honors the lives and the uh, professional accomplishments of so many Black teachers and principals and others. So again, Dr. Fenwick, thank you so much for being a part of this episode of Turning Pages. Really, I mean, we could talk for hours and hours. I still
Yes.
haven't gotten to about 6 or 7 of my points I wanted to make, but I won't because it's going to take us down another whole path. But we're going to have you back, not just to
Thank
talk
you.
about your work, your research, but to also perspective on a variety of things that impact um, our work at HBCUs and certainly in the field of teacher education, preparation, principal preparation, and all the kinds of things that your book really does illuminate. So again, thank you so much. And thanks to the audience for joining us today. This has been a simply fabulous episode of Turning Pages. We want to thank Professor and Dean Emerita Leslie Fenwick here at Howard University, whose work continues to impact the field. And so, again, thanks for joining us and have a great day.
Thank you, Dr. Carter.
Thank you.